For our recruiting app, we need an approval process to submit new positions for approval. We want to make sure that a manager approves any position that his or her employee creates, and that any position with a minimum salary of more than 150,000 is approved by the CEO. Let's get started. For this approval process, the only preliminary step we need to define is an email template that can be used to notify the designated approver that he or she has pending approval request. You can build it from Setup, Communication Templates, Email Templates, give it a name, subject, new position requires approval. The email would read, "A new position record has been submitted for your approval. Please visit the link below and either approve it or reject it. Thanks." Now that we have finished our preparation, we are ready to define the approval process itself. The approval process definition acts as a framework for the approval steps and actions that we define later. Search for the approval process. We need an approval process to submit new positions for approval. There are two different wizards that we can use to create a new approval process: a Jumpstart wizard and a standard setup wizard. The Jumpstart wizard skips a couple of steps. Let me use the standard setup wizard so that we can take a look at all the options that are available. I'll call this process Approve New Position. Ensure that the manager approves any position that his or her employee creates, and any position with a minimum salary of greater than 150,000 is approved by the CEO. Let's define the criteria so that only new positions can be submitted for approval, and all positions created by a user other than the CEO must be approved by at least a direct manager. In our case, Anthony is the CEO of Universal Containers. Go to the next step. From the next automated approver determined by the drop-down list, select Manager. The Manager field is a standard field on the user object that designates the user's manager. Alternatively, you could have defined a new custom hierarchical relationship field on the fly. For this approval process, though, the standard manager field is perfect. So let's move on. Use approver field of position owner. When you select this checkbox, the approval request is routed to the user specified in the manager field on the record owner's user record. If you don't select this checkbox, the approval request is routed to the manager of the user submitting the record. In our case, we want to obtain approval from the position owner's manager. So select this checkbox. Record editability allows you to specify whether a record that's been submitted for approval can be edited by the approver before being approved. Since we don't want managers to change that, we'll only let administrators perform edits while a record is in our approval process. Let's go to the next step. Select the email template that we just created. Here, we need to specify which fields should be displayed on the approver page layout, which the approver sees when he or she approves or rejects a record. Let me add a couple of fields: position title, job description, minimum pay, and maximum pay. And I also want the approval history to be displayed as a related list. This information shows whether this record was submitted for approval in the past, who were the designated approvers, and whether it was approved or rejected. Finally, before leaving this page, we can specify the security settings to determine whether an approver can approve or reject records from a mobile device. Unless it's a mandatory requirement for your approvers, it's better not to choose this option because It prevents a user from manually selecting an appropriate approver for a record. We'll leave the default choice selected for now. The last page of the approval process wizard allows us to choose who should be allowed to submit records for approval. Again, we'll just leave the default record owner selected because there's no reason for another user to have this power. And allow submitters to recall approval requests just in case and save. We have finished defining the framework for our approval process, but we won't be able to activate it unless we have given it some steps and some actions to fire when records are actually approved or rejected. Let's move on to those now. Let me go back to the process detail page. As we said earlier, every approval process consists of a set of steps that are required to approve the creation of a new record, and each step allows one or more designated approvers to accept or reject the submitted record. For our new position approval process, we need to define two steps. One that requires approval from the record submitters manager for all new position records, and one that requires additional approval from the CEO for position records with minimum salaries in excess of $150,000. Let's define the first step for all new position records now. In this first step, we want the approval request to go to the position owner's manager. I'll call it Manager Approval. Every new position record must be approved by the position owner's manager. This is going to be the first step. By assigning this as step 1, it will be the first to execute when the approval process is triggered. This step allows us to define the criteria or create a formula that filters the records that require approval during this step. Because we have already filtered out position records that are owned by the CEO from the whole approval process, this step does not need any additional filtering. Let's go to the next step. Finally, we have to select the assigned approver for this step and specify whether his or her delegate is allowed to approve the request as well. Because this is a manager approval step, it clearly makes sense to accept the default option of automatically assign using the custom field selected earlier, which is the manager. The approver's delegate may also approve this request and save. We are faced with another choice to create optional approval or rejection actions for this step, or return to the approval process detail page. Take me back to the approval process detail page to review what I've just created. From the approval steps related list, let's create a new approval step. This time, CEO's approval. Every new position record with a minimum salary over $150,000 must be approved by the CEO. It's the second step. Here, we only want to send positions with a minimum salary of over $150,000 to the CEO. Enter the step if the following criteria are met. Minimum pay greater than $150,000 and save. The approver for this step is the CEO. From the drop-down list, look up to the user who's the CEO in your organization. In this case, I'm picking Anthony, who's the CEO of Universal Containers. We are keeping this approval process fairly simple, but if we wanted to, we could send the approval request to multiple approvers in this step and determine whether the user's approval request needed unanimous approval or if the record would be approved or rejected based on the first user to respond to that request. Approve or reject based on first response. The approver's delegate may also approve this request. The next section allows us to specify what to do with the record if it's rejected at this step. Because the position record is locked from editing during the approval process, it makes the most sense to perform the final rejection. You can perform all rejection actions for this step and all final rejection actions and save. Once again, we are faced with a choice to define approval or rejection actions for this particular step. I'll do this later. Take me back to the process detail page to review what I've just created. Now that we have finished defining our approval process steps, we are nearly done. All that remains is to specify the approval actions that could occur whenever a record is initially submitted or when it's finally approved or rejected. From the initial submission actions related list, let's add a new action and select Field Update. Set status to pending approval. While a position is in the approval process, its status should be set to pending approval. The status field should be set to specific value. Pending approval, and save. You can also configure final approval actions and rejection actions. From the final approval actions related list, I can add a new action and select a field update and set status to open approved. After the position is approved, its status should be set to open approved. The status field should be set to specific value. Its status should be set to open approved, and save. From the final rejection actions related list, you can also configure rejection actions like updating the status field to closed, not approved. We are all done with defining our approval process. But in order to test it, it needs to be activated. Fortunately, the Force.com platform has a process visualizer that renders the approval process as a flowchart. The flowchart contains all the critical details for each approval process, including the steps necessary for a record to be approved, the designated approvers for each step, the criteria used to trigger the approval process, and the actions that take place when a record is approved, rejected, or recalled. Now, let's test our approval process. From Setup, Manage Users, Users, and edit the user record, and select the Manager field so that the approval chain is properly set up. Let me set Sam as my manager and save. Now, let me create a new position. Notice that after clicking Save, the detail page displays a Submit for Approval button in the new approval history related list. I can submit the record for approval. Submitting the record for approval causes several things to happen. First, the record is locked from editing, as shown by the lock icon at the top of the page. Additionally, two new entries appear in the approval history related list, showing who submitted the record and the current approval assignment. Finally, the manager of the position owner is notified by an email that there is a new position to approve. When the manager next logs in and visits the record, he or she can click on the button to see the approval request and approve or reject the record with comments. If the approver accepts the record, it progresses to the next step of the approval process. With just a few minutes of work, we have built an effective business process that will make all of Universal Containers users more effective.